Hey everybody, it's Captain Nabs here once again with another video in my series of SimBrief tutorials. In the first two videos, I showed you how to make a basic SimBrief flight plan, and I showed you how to input that flight plan into your basic FMS. For the third video in this series, we're going to take a very in-depth look at all of the options that are available on the SimBrief flight planning page. There's a lot of options here, so this video has gotten pretty long, but I wanted to make sure that I explained all of the options that are available. If you want to make the most of the SimBrief system, I suggest you watch this video in its entirety to learn about all the options available here. You don't have to use every option every single day, but it's nice to know that these options are available for those particular situations where they may come in handy. So we're going to start and just go through this form starting pretty much right at the top here. So flight info is pretty obvious. You just put in your airline and your flight number. If you are not flying an airline flight, if you're flying a civil registration, like you're just flying Charlie Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie is your civil registration, just put that under flight number. But if you're flying an airline flight, put it under airline and flight number. So today we're going to do American Flight 001. Type in your destination and your origin. We already talked about that before. One nice thing that SimBrief does for you, of course, is it does automatically offer you an alternate based on where you're going and the nearby weather. So it looks at the weather, makes sure that the weather at the closest major airport nearby meets the alternate criteria. If it doesn't, it'll look at other airports farther away. So it'll select an airport that should meet the legal criteria. That doesn't mean you have to accept the first choice that SimBrief offers you. One really neat feature of SimBrief's setup page here is this little weather icon right here next to each of the departure, arrival, and alternate fields. As you can see, when you put your mouse over this little weather icon, it will show you the current METAR and TAF, the current weather and the forecast conditions for the departure airport, the arrival airport, and the alternate airport. So when you're looking at the alternate airport, you can see if it meets your criteria. You can also look at the arrival airport and see how close to minimums is it. Is it going to be a good day? Is it going to be a bad day? How likely am I going to need this alternate? So it just gives you a really quick and easy way to kind of look at the weather and evaluate whether this alternate choice is probably going to be needed or probably not, and whether or not it really is truly a good choice. You can, of course, specify the date and time for your departure. This affects a couple of things. This affects, first of all, the planning. The wind forecast that is used will be changed based on when you plan to leave. So there's usually a wind forecast published for up to 48 hours from now. So you can pick a date up to 48 hours from now, and you'll be able to get the realistic forecast winds for that time period instead of right now. Or you could just leave it, and it usually defaults to about a half an hour from now. The next section I've got to talk about here is the selection section, and there's lots of really good stuff here. This is kind of options that help us create the flight plan we want to create. You'll see there's a save default button. You can actually save whatever settings in this little box here as a default setting for every time you start a new SimBrief flight plan. The couple of things here, we've got the OFP layout, so you can select what format you want the actual flight plan output to look like. You can use the Lido format. You can use any number of different airline formats as well. Every airline generally formats their flight plan a little bit different. The same basic information is there, but based on how they operate, they decide to put things in slightly different order. So here is a whole bunch of different real-world airlines that you can choose. I like the default Lido system. It is again, this is Lufthansa's system. Lufthansa Integrated Dispatch Operations is what Lido stands for, and I think it makes one of the most organized and sensible flight plans. But you can pick one that either just, you can experiment with them and see which ones have information laid out the way you like it, or you can go with one specific to the airline that you like to operate, whether it be JetBlue, British Airways, Southwest, whatever. All the options are there. Of course, we can select the units we want to use, whether we want all of our weights to be in kilogram or pounds, depending on how our aircraft is configured. So usually in Europe, most of the airplanes are configured to work in kilograms. In North America, most of them are configured to work in pounds, but there's always exceptions. A lot of the Airbuses are in kilograms no matter where they operate. So you select the units that you want to see, and then we can talk about our contingency and our reserve fuel. So let's talk about the reserve fuel first. Reserve fuel is the absolute last fuel that you're required to have in the tanks by law when you reach your alternate. So this is the last 30 minutes of fuel. So when you reach your alternate, you should still have 30 minutes of fuel left in the airplane just in case anything else goes wrong. For most jets in most countries, usually the reserve fuel is 30 minutes. Usually for turboprops on IFR flight, it goes up to 45 minutes, but you can select any number of variations. An airline, for example, may have a more restrictive requirement. They may require an hour or 45 minutes instead of just 30 minutes of reserve fuel, depending on the airline. So you can select your reserve fuel. The contingency fuel is fuel that is added to allow for maneuvering and delays, slight variations while you're traveling between your origin and your destination. So while you're en route, ATC may cause a delay that you may be number 5 in line for takeoff or 10 in line for takeoff. There may be a hold. They may need to turn you a little bit to avoid some weather or to avoid some traffic. Basically, the contingency fuel increases that absolute minimum fuel burn between your departure and your arrival. So let's say you need 1,000 pounds to get from JFK to Los Angeles. Obviously, that's not nearly enough. But let's say you needed 1,000 pounds. Contingency 5% will add 50 additional pounds to that, just to allow for a little bit of extra maneuvering without, so that you don't go below the minimum fuel just because you got a little bit off course or somehow got put in a vector that was a little bit longer than the flight plan. So contingency can be varied. Generally, the standard is 5%, but there are a number of different options. You can use an EASA standard. You can select 3 or 5% or 15 minutes, whichever is less. So a lot of airlines will have 5% or 10 minutes. So whichever is less, 5% of the fuel or 10 minutes of additional fuel is a different way to handle it. Or you can just use a straight up percent as is the default value here, 5%. And you can pretty much do almost any amount you want in terms of percent or also in terms of time. So contingency fuel could be done by time, but usually it's done as a percentage because the longer the flight, the more chances there are things are going to go wrong with it. So the more contingency fuel you'll carry. But again, you can select this to suit your airline's needs or your personal tastes. The remainder of the options here have pretty much to do mostly with formatting the output of our flight plan. So when we generate the PDF flight plan, what do we want to include in our flight plan? Do we want to have a detailed nav log that shows all the waypoints and the fuel and time over each waypoint? Do we want to have ETOPS planning? ETOPS is extended twin operations. So this is for aircraft, twin engine aircraft that are flying long distances from land. So if you're just doing domestic flying, you probably won't need that. But if you are trying to fly a 737 or even a 777 across the pond, you're required to make sure you know where your alternate airports are in case of an engine failure. So ETOPS planning will give you pages that show you when you're closest to each airport, whether the origin, the destination, or whether there's some alternate airports along route that you can divert to. Plan step climbs, so you can decide whether or not you want to allow step climbs in your flight plan. If you just want to pick one cruise altitude and stick with it the whole time, just uncheck that. Otherwise, by default, SimBrief will generate additional step climbs. Runway analysis. So if the aircraft has a takeoff and performance and landing data stored in SimBrief, you can generate an analysis of how you'll be able to get off the runway, how much power and speed you'll need to get off the runway. NOTAMs and FIR NOTAMs, so we can decide if we want to see NOTAMs within our flight plan, and we can decide if we want to see FIR NOTAMs, so en route NOTAMs. So by default, NOTAMs would include our origin, our destination, our alternate. FIR NOTAMs will be NOTAMs for the en route airspace we may pass through on our way from JFK to Los Angeles. And we can also select how many flight maps we want to see in our flight plan, whether we have detailed ones, whether we have one map that's just the route only, a simple map, or none at all. Since you don't actually have to print this and no paper is actually generated, there's really no point in selecting anything other than detailed. But again, you can select the options to suit your needs or your virtual airline's needs, so you can simulate whatever kind of operation you want to simulate. The next section we'll talk about here is aircraft type, which is fairly self-explanatory, but there are some neat things we can do with this. So, of course, there's a drop-down list with all the different aircraft types that SimBrief recognizes, that SimBrief has stored performance information for. What you can also do is you can create a customized list of your own personal aircraft that you like and have them appear here at the top of the list. So to show you how to do that, you can open the aircraft editor right here. And what you'll see here is a list of your fleet. So you can customize a fleet of aircraft and have it appear at the top of your list. So if you like to fly the 777, you can set up your own 777, and if it's in your customized list, it will appear at the top of that select aircraft list. So the ones you like to fly will appear at the top instead of just having to scroll down through the whole list in alphabetical order. What's also really neat about all of these aircraft that you create in your custom fleet is that you can assign them all sorts of custom information as well. So you can assign them a custom registration, a FIN number, a fleet identification number within your airline. You can you can specify a CellCal code that's always saved for that aircraft. You can also even change things like the default empty weight for a particular aircraft. So SimBrief generates generic values based on the performance information provided by the manufacturer for each different aircraft type. But if you know for a fact that your aircraft has a slightly different zero fuel weight, your PMDG aircraft has a slightly different fuel weight, you can specify it here. You can specify the number of seats that are available in your aircraft. So whether you have a multi-class, first class economy class configuration, or maybe you just have one all economy class low cost carrier configuration, you can choose the maximum number of passengers within your aircraft. So you can customize almost all of the various options. You can have a default cost index, assign a certain flight fuel factor, which we'll talk about shortly, a lower or higher service ceiling, all sorts of different factors. So for each aircraft within your fleet, you can customize the aircraft completely so that you can generate a flight plan with that aircraft that meets your needs. So now we're going to talk about the advanced aircraft options section. And this really has two kind of subsections. The top line here deals almost entirely with performance, how the performance of our aircraft will be calculated for this particular flight plan. And the bottom is just some extra details about our aircraft. So as you can see, we've got a couple of different profiles, and what's inserted here will change based on the type of aircraft you select. So the different performance profiles that may be available to SimBrief for a Dash 8 versus a 737. And you'll see it's broken down into three major sections here: climb, cruise, and descent. So climb and descent will usually work fairly similarly. There may be only one option to choose from, as there is in the case of 737, or there may be multiple options. In this case, it's indicating that our climb is based on a profile of flying at 250 knots till we get to 10,000 feet, 280 knots or 0.78 above 10,000 feet. And the inverse is true for the descent profile. While we're still above 10,000 feet, we'll do either Mach 7.8 or 208 knots, whichever is less, and then we'll slow down to 250 knots when we get down to 10,000 feet. So these profiles are pretty much fixed for this aircraft type. Where we usually get the most control is actually in the cruise profile itself. So the cruise profile, there's two drop-down boxes here. The first one is actually the type of cruise profile we're going to use. We have the choice of a few different types depending on the type of aircraft we use. Again, for the 737-800 I've selected here, we can have either a cost index or CI profile, or we can have some fixed speed profiles, Mach 7.6, 7.8, 7.9, 8.0, or we can have the long range cruise or LRC profile. If I select anything besides CI, you'll see the second selection box disappears because these are all fixed speed profiles, and it will burn whatever fuel is necessary to maintain these particular speed profiles. However, with the CI or cost index profile, we get a second drop-down box where we can actually select the type of cost index we would like. So what is a cost index? A cost index is a bit of a complicated topic, but essentially what it is it's a ratio of fuel burn to time en route. The lower the cost index number, the lower the fuel burn until you eventually reach a cost index of 0. 0 is the lowest cost index you can get, which is basically the equivalent of long-range cruise. This is the lowest possible amount of fuel we can burn to get to our destination. From there, we increase our cost index, we'll increase our speed, which will increase our power setting, which will increase our fuel consumption. So the higher up the cost index we go, the more fuel we'll burn, but the faster we will get to our destination. Different airlines will operate in different ways. Some will use the automatic function, which I'll talk about in a moment. Some will operate with a fixed cost index. So an airline may choose to always operate its flights at cost index 10 or cost index 25 unless there's some overriding reason to use something else, such as perhaps a long flight that requires long-range cruise. Or they may even have a fixed cost index on every leg. But what most airlines will probably do is they will use the auto profile of cost index. What the auto profile for cost index will do is will work backwards for us. So you'll see just down below here, you'll see scheduled flight time. When you put in your origin and destination, SimBrief will estimate the amount of time it takes to get between these two airports normally and put this into the scheduled flight time field. Notice, of course, we can change it and increase or decrease it if we want to. When we take the scheduled flight time, which is from gate to gate, and we subtract our taxi out and our taxi in time, we'll arrive at an overall air time, how long it's going to take us from takeoff to landing. So 6 hours and 15 minutes minus 28 is 5 hours and 47 minutes. What SimBrief is going to do is it's going to take that 5 hours and 47 minutes of projected air time, and it's going to say, what cost index will give me 5 hours and 47 minutes. So it's going to automatically decide what number is going to give it exactly 5 hours and 47 minutes and thus get us to our destination precisely on time without burning any extra fuel. You can see it's a pretty useful system to use Cost Index Auto if you know the schedule of flight time you want to have en route, but you can always select a customized flight profile here. You can select any cost index up from 0 all the way up to 100, whatever works best for your particular situation. For us simmers, where we don't care so much about the time en route, we may often want to select a higher default cost index. The last field we have here is called fuel factor. Fuel factor is basically an extra percentage we can add to our overall fuel burn for the flight based on our analysis of the previous operation of the aircraft. So normally it's given as a plus. This case it's +0 right now, but we could do say +5. This would be +5%. And what this is going to do is it's going to do the whole calculation for our fuel burn for our entire flight. And then when it's done all of the fuel calculations, it's then going to increase it by 5%. This fuel factor exists in the real world as well, and most airlines use it on their fleets. As their fleets age, aircraft become a little bit less efficient, not everything fits together as well as it used to, and so they tend to burn a little bit more fuel than the ideal manufacturer's guidelines. So this accounts for that little increase over time. So if you find that your aircraft in the sim are burning a little bit more fuel than you always plan on, then you can add this fuel factor and it will automatically increase the entire fuel burn of the aircraft by 5%. And if you remember, you can actually set this back in the aircraft customized fleet editor here. So you can actually, for different types, select a fuel factor and it will always load when you load that particular customized aircraft. You can even have a minus fuel factor if you wanted to. So if you found that SimBrief was overestimating all the time for your particular aircraft type, perhaps the model that you operate in the sim is not burning a realistic fuel burn, you can even associate a minus fuel factor with that particular aircraft type. The remaining fields here in the aircraft options field are just simply some extra informational fields. If you're operating an airline flight, you can actually specify the registration of the aircraft you're operating if there's not one saved, or it'll just automatically generate one for you. Likewise for the FIN number, the CellCal code, and if you want to use a call sign that's different than your airline flight number, you can specify it right down here. Otherwise, it will default to your airline's call sign. You can also specify a custom CellCal code to save with this particular flight plan, or it may default to what you have edited before in your aircraft editor. Optional entries. Again, these are fields that SimBrief will generate some default values for, but you can customize these to make your flight plan a little bit more useful and a little bit more realistic. As we mentioned before, there's a scheduled flight time. This primarily impacts a couple of things. First of all, the planned arrival time based on your planned departure time that you put in. And also, as I said before, if you have cost index in auto, the scheduled flight time will affect what cost index actually gets selected. SimBrief will try to meet the scheduled flight time. The airtime, of course, is not the scheduled flight time. Scheduled flight time is gate to gate. So if you look over here, there's a taxi out and a taxi in. These are times. 20 minutes to taxi out, 8 minutes to taxi in. So for the time we leave the gate, we have to push back, start the engines, taxi to the runway. The estimate is that it will take 20 minutes. When we land, it estimates that we're going to take 8 minutes to taxi in to our gate at Los Angeles. So our scheduled flight time minus these two values will equal our target airtime that the cost index is trying to meet. So we're taking away 28 minutes for taxi out and taxi in from 6:15. This basically takes us to about 5 hours and 47 minutes. So that's what the cost index profile back here is going to target for this flight. It's going to target 5 hours and 47 minutes. It's going to adjust the cost index to get as close to that 547 as possible so that we will take exactly the scheduled flight time, not going too fast, but not arriving behind schedule. SimBrief will automatically also assign default departure and arrival runways based on the winds and the wind forecast at your departure and your arrival point. However, you can always change the runway so that the planning will be based on a different runway, whatever you think is most likely to be used. The one field that I find that I will always adjust here is extra fuel, because for whatever reason, and I'm really not sure why, but SimBrief defaults to 0 extra fuel and never lets you pack on extra fuel. As a personal general rule, I always try to bring at least 15 to 20 minutes of extra fuel. So you can select your extra fuel in terms of kilograms, or probably the easier thing, depending on the aircraft type, is just to select minutes. And then select a number of minutes, 20 minutes, and now when we generate our flight plan, you're going to see that 20 minutes of additional fuel is loaded. So after all the fuel burn that is required is calculated, we're going to then load 20 additional minutes of fuel just to allow for contingencies such as takeoff and landing delays, vectoring holds, weather, you name it. Here's just some extra fuel above the minimum that we absolutely require just to put into the tanks. Altitude, again, normally SimBrief will automatically select the most optimal altitude based on the wind forecast available and our aircraft's performance, taking into account that it can only climb so high if it's at a certain weight. But we can also manually specify an altitude if we don't want SimBrief to automatically specify it, but we perhaps want to limit ourselves to a lower altitude because we know a certain route, a short route between two airports requires perhaps a lower limited altitude than usual. We can specify an altitude here, or just leave it auto and SimBrief will pick the most optimal altitude for you. Passengers and freight allows you to specify how much is being carried in the aircraft, so we can pick how many passengers, or we can even just pick full. If we leave it in auto, then a random number will be generated by SimBrief. Likewise for freight. So if you want to carry a certain amount of cargo, you can specify the amount. This is in thousands of either pounds or kilograms, thousands of weight units, depending on which one you have. You can also, again, select full. You can select any specific value, or you can just let SimBrief automatically generate random values for your flight plan. Random number of passengers, random freight cargo weight. ZFW, again, same thing. You can basically specify the ZFW for your particular flight. The better thing is to probably let SimBrief automatically calculate it. So based on the number of passengers, the amount of cargo being brought, and the empty weight of our airplane that we picked, if we leave it in auto, it will automatically calculate what the ZFW is supposed to be and put it on our flight plan. You can put your dispatcher's name here if you want to name a specific dispatcher, or just let it randomly pick from the name of dispatchers. Your captain's name will appear here. This is specified when you set up your user account here on SimBrief, and your pilot ID for SimBrief. This is a very useful field right here because a lot of add-ons that use SimBrief will ask for your pilot ID so that it knows which account to access. So this is basically your SimBrief account number. So when you're setting up your FMS in your various add-ons to automatically retrieve your SimBrief flight plan and it asks for a SimBrief ID or a pilot ID, use this number that appears here in your particular flight plan. Dispatch remarks just allows you to put a random set of remarks. If you're creating this flight plan for other people, or even if you're creating it for yourself and you just want to point out something or remember something for the future, you can literally type in anything you want here and it will appear on your flight plan under the dispatch remarks section. The next little section is a very quick and easy section. It's just the AIRAC cycle. So you can see that I'm currently using the 2206 AIRAC cycle, which is the current cycle. If the current cycle that I've selected expires, it'll show up here as red. All I have to do is go into my AIRAC options and I can select past ones that I have used, or I can just simply update my current AIRAC to use the current AIRAC instead of using an outdated one. Note that you have to be a Navigraph subscriber in order to be able to access current ones. Otherwise, you're restricted to always using an outdated AIRAC cycle. One of the most useful features here in SimBrief is the route selection tool. There are any number of ways that you can generate a route using SimBrief, so we're just going to go through a bunch of them here. The first thing is that when you select a destination and origin, SimBrief will offer you a default route. Usually this is the first suggested route. It's going to be offered to you by default. You'll see here a quick analysis underneath here for your route. Your route is valid for this current AIRAC. If there's any airways that are missing that are no longer valid, waypoints, stars, or SIDs that have expired, it'll tell you right here with a little red warning. And it'll also tell you your route distance, 2210 nautical miles plus 3%. So this route is 3% longer than the direct distance between these two airports, which is a pretty reasonable route. You won't usually get too much less than 3%. You may get a lot longer, but usually there's almost always some departure and arrival procedure that adds a little bit of extra distance between the airports. But this allows you to compare different routes and see how they compare. You'll see here a bunch of suggested routes. These routes come from several different places. They'll come from real-world flights. They'll come from other SimBrief users that have generated them. So we can look through this list. We can click on different ones very quickly, and you'll see the differences here. This one is 3.6% instead of 3%. If I scroll down a little bit, you'll see dynamically it draws on the map here as I select a new route. So this one was 3%. This one is plus 3.6%. It's a little bit longer. This one is plus 13.6%. And every once in a while, the map will do that and scroll really weird. This one is only plus 2.3%, so this is the most direct route. And then if you see here, we've got a pop out here, we can select even more routes. So these first couple of routes here, it even tells you where it got them from. These are real world flight routes. So generated from FlightAware. These are routes that actual aircraft have flown between these cities. And you can click on these here as well and see that it does change as you are clicking on these routes. You'll also find routes generated by SimBrief users. So now we're into SimBrief routes. People have selected these routes before using SimBrief. You may find some other saved routes, other ways that routes have been generated, but there's any number of routes. This particular route, there's 14 different, or this particular city pair, there's 14 different routes SimBrief has available. We can, of course, customize anything. This text box is completely customizable, so if you want to change anything, you can customize anything you want in here. If you know how to type in a route string, put in different waypoints, you can put whatever you want in here. There's also other different ways of generating routes. You can go onto FlightAware, SkyVector, Route Finder, Global Route Database, EDI GLA, AutoRouter, and IFPS validation, and you can check this route, look for other routes, and check this route. So IFPS validation, for example, takes you to the Eurocontrol screen, and it actually lets you validate whether or not this is a valid flight plan route on the Eurocontrol screen. Clicking on FlightAware lets you see different routes that are available on FlightAware. So here's some recent routes that have been filed between JFK, LAX, and the frequency. 9 people have selected this route, 8, this route, 2, this route, and so on and so forth. So you can see which routes have been used, which routes have been popular. Another powerful tool in SimBrief is the route finder itself. So you can use this tool to auto-generate a custom route. So if you don't like any of the routes here, something's wrong with them, or you want to fly over a specific point, you can then use the route options. So you can input an estimated altitude, speed, and a type of route, whether it's automatic, which usually means RNAV, or VOR route only. And then you can specify whether you want to avoid specific fixes or fly over specific fixes. So if we need a flight between JFK and Los Angeles that has to fly over, let's say, the Badger VOR, type in BAE, and then you can hit Find Route. SimBrief will usually take a couple of seconds to crunch this, but it will find a route and put it back up here in the route field that includes this VOR. Sometimes SimBrief fails when this happens. It's pretty complicated trying to generate these routes and uses a fair amount of computing power. So every once in a while SimBrief will fail. Usually if you try it a second time, it will usually succeed. So now SimBrief has picked a route using this particular waypoint and then trying to find waypoints that get us to and from that route. So you can see it's not the most efficient route in the world. It used up plus 5.9%, but you will see that somewhere in here, there it is in the middle, Badger did appear. So if you have a specific point you need to fly over, or you have a specific point you need to or want to avoid, you can specify this here and let SimBrief help you. You can even specify whether or not you want to use NAT tracks. So if you're doing a transatlantic flight and you want to specify a specific track, or just use auto to let SimBrief pick a track for you, you can generate a route that way. We also have an option to use historical weather. If you use ActiveSky in the FSX and P3D world, you have the option of loading historical weather in ActiveSky, and so flying weather from a previous day instead of the current weather. So this allows you to input that weather snapshot, export it from your ActiveSky file, and import it into SimBrief so that your flight plan will be accurate for the historical weather from a previous date that you plan to use. Normally by default, SimBrief will calculate your flight plan based on today's weather, or otherwise by the departure time you specified above. One other really useful field here that SimBrief has available is customizing alternate airports. You'll note that you're not even limited to one airport. You can have up to 4 alternate airports for your flight. So you will see a fuel plan and a routing for each one. So if you're not sure if one alternate is going to hold up, you can use multiple airports. Your other option is to use one of them as a via airport. So for example, if the weather at your destination is not great, and we know that another nearby airport should be good enough to get in, but it's not good enough to really legally hold as an alternate, we can have multiple alternates here. We can have one that we really want to go to, and then we can have one that's perhaps further away, and we'll calculate the fuel burn for both and be able to determine whether or not we can get to both of those airports with the fuel we have on board. We can also specify a takeoff alternate in our SimBrief flight plan. What do you need a takeoff alternate for? Well, a takeoff alternate is usually only specified when you're doing a low visibility takeoff. So if you're taking off from an airport, let's say we're taking off from JFK, and the weather is so bad that if something happened immediately after takeoff, we could not land again, then we have to specify a takeoff alternate. So if something happens like an engine failure happens right after we take off and we could not land again, if it's below normal landing minimums, Category 1 minimums are normally the only ones we consider for takeoff alternates. We don't consider the fact we could do Cat 2 approaches or Cat 3 approaches. But if the weather at New York is a quarter mile in fog, we can legally take off, but we can't legally land again. So in that case, we'd need to find a takeoff alternate. You can specify a takeoff alternate by typing it in the field here if you know what you want to use, or you can ask SimBrief to find one for you. There will usually be a maximum search distance, and this will usually depend on the regulatory environment you're in. In the US, the maximum distance you can fly to a takeoff alternate is usually determined by the number of engines on your airplane. In other jurisdictions, it may just be a set amount of time. So in many jurisdictions, it may be 30 minutes or 60 minutes of flying time, but you can specify how many miles you want to search. Hit find, and now we found a takeoff alternate. We can even check the weather here and just make sure that yes, this is good enough weather. If anything happens taking off from New York, we're going to immediately divert to Boston as our takeoff alternate. En-route alternates allows you to specify an alternate airport that you would like to plan on landing at if anything happens while you're halfway to your destination. So usually an en-route alternate is something close to your flight plan route where you can divert to if you have any issues while you're en route. The nice thing about specifying an en-route alternate airport is that it allows you to see the weather at that particular airport, and you will have a copy of the weather and NOTAMs. And if we actually look here, you'll see that we actually have a circle around here to show us where this alternate is relative to our whole flight plan. And one of the last big features here on SimBrief is the map function. And this is a very useful function for when you're trying to pick a route, especially something that you may not be familiar with. As you saw before, when we're specifying and selecting a different route, it will show us on this map where our routes are. If we remove those alternate fields, I can show you some of the other stuff that you can turn on this map. You can see, of course, our routing here with latitude and longitude. If you're doing an ETOPS flight, you can show designated ETOPS airport along your route. So if we were doing a transatlantic flight, it would show us where all the possible ETOPS airports we can fly to are and make sure we are staying within the minimum legal range of those airports. There's other filters we can turn on. We can turn on all the airports that are stored in the SimBrief database here just so we can see where nearby alternates might be. We can even specify ones that we like as alternates, usually ones that have their own weather forecast, and ETOPS alternates. So again, this shows how far away we can be from these different alternates while we're flying transatlantic. So we have to be able to fly to these airports within a certain set period of time, so we can't fly outside of those dark rings. You can also show all the VORs or NDBs or even fixes in the SimBrief database. If you're looking at a large airspace, this is obviously a ridiculous number of fixes. You can also show the airways along your route, allowing you to scroll around and pick airways to fly along. And you can select high or low-level airways. And you can also select to see the NATS and PACOTS tracks. So the North Atlantic track system, here are today's North Atlantic tracks. You can see where they all are and how they compare to your route, and you can pick one that would be useful for you to fly. You can even screen out either the east or the west ones. Likewise, you can do this for the Pacific tracks as well, and screen out the east and the west. And any Australian tracks that might be published can also be shown here. You can also show FIRs, flight information regions, and see the various divisions you would have to fly through to get from one point to another. But some of the most useful tools you've got here at the end are the weather tools. You can actually put the weather radar up on your map and see if there's any bad weather along your route. This route does not look so good today with this weather here over Ohio, so maybe we want to pick a different route. Maybe we can go around that weather. You can pick any number of recent weather puff shots, or you can just simply scroll through and see the animation. Once it's loaded all of them, you should see it scroll through nice and smoothly here. So definitely don't want to be flying this area today. You can also display the significant weather forecast. So this will show you where there's significant weather along your route, including the location of the jet streams, and usually thunderstorms, hurricanes, major snowstorms, etc. And last but not least, we can also do upper wind forecasts for various altitudes and also various times in the future as far as our forecast extends. So we can look at all the different options here and try and pick the best altitude. So today, looking at this, the wind is kind of pretty strong up here to the north. So if anything, a southern route to go from New York to Los Angeles would be a little bit more useful. You can also look at different altitudes and see if going higher or lower might increase or decrease your winds. And you can accomplish some useful flight planning that way. So that's basically it for the Generate Flight Plan page. As you can see, we have just an absolute ton of options available for us to choose from here, which helps make SimBrief a very useful system, whether you're a novice user or a power user. And best of all, SimBrief always offers you great default options. So as soon as you put in your origin, your destination, and your type of aircraft, SimBrief will offer you default options that will get you there just fine. But if you're becoming a little bit more of a skilled planner and want to delve into a little bit more detail and be a little bit more specific with your planning, SimBrief gives you the option to customize almost everything about your flight plan.